Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. In mid-September, I was sitting next to the journalist Sally Hayden, attending a press briefing near the United Nations when her phone started buzzing with WhatsApp messages. Refugees and migrants stranded in a prison in Libya had gotten her number and were sending her messages describing the deplorable conditions of their confinement. Sally Hayden is a freelance journalist, and as she explains, thousands of refugees and migrants, mostly from Eastern and Sub-Saharan Africa, are languishing indefinitely in prison in Libya after having been captured by Libyan Coast Guard units as these would-be refugees tried to make their way to Italy. These would-be refugees are now prisoners in areas rife with conflict. They're left without food or water, often subject to torture. It is an ongoing human rights calamity that gets very little attention. And so I was extremely glad to have Sally Hayden on the show to discuss her reporting. The best way to follow Sally Hayden's work is on Twitter, and I'll post a link to her handle on globaldispatchespodcast.com. She also asked me to ask you to send her any questions via Twitter you have about her reporting. And on her Twitter page, she'll also often post screen caps of the messages she receives from people stranded in prison in Libya. It's very important, I think, to read those and to understand what's going on. And I was very, very glad to have Sally on the show to discuss her reporting. So here is my conversation with journalist Sally Hayden. I remember sitting next to you at these press briefings, and your WhatsApp would buzz with these messages from individual migrants and refugees stranded in these detention centers in Libya. I guess, how is it that you came to the story, or maybe more specifically, how is it that they came to you?
So I report on a lot on migration issues and refugee issues across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And last year I reported in Sudan and did kind of a series of different reports looking at various issues. And one of them particularly became quite well known among refugees there, which was looking at alleged corruption in the UNHCR resettlement program. And as a result of that, a lot of refugees got in touch with me just generally to speak about the situation there. And so in August, it was actually August 26th, I still remember, a Sunday, I was at home in London and I got this message from a man who said that his brother was in Sudan and his brother had given him my number, and he was actually in Libya in a detention center. And what he said was that a war had broken out around them and they really desperately needed some help. And obviously, I'm a journalist, but I'm sitting at home in London kind of going, can this be real? Like, do I take this seriously? What's going on? And I just talked to him all day through WhatsApp, just asked him to send me selfies, send me GPS locations, send me more information. I have some contacts in Libya who I could cross-check that information with. And they all told me that what he was saying appeared to be true, that there was a detention center where he said that it wasn't accessible, that there was fighting happening around it. And from there, I kind of, after about 24 hours, I was like, okay, it seems like this is a real story. What happened was that they had been abandoned by the guards, left without food and water. Men, women, and children. And they were sending me pictures of people with kind of huge weapons patrolling outside and smoke rising around them, and them just absolutely terrified, having no idea what to do. So from there, then my number over the past 2 months has just been passed around a lot of different migrants and refugees in different detention centers, and I've now got contacts in in quite a few of them.
And I know the most recent story of yours that I read was recently an article that I believe appeared in the Irish Times about a Somali man who set himself on fire in one of these detention centers. Can you, what do we know about who that man was or is if he managed to live?
So he actually died, and I mean, it's obviously incredibly distressing for everybody. So I got a message on Wednesday last week saying that a man had set himself on fire and had died. He had got petrol. And what I was told by the refugees who saw it happen was that he had been told by visiting UNHCR officials that he had little chance at evacuation. And essentially, what they all want at this stage is just to be evacuated to a safe country. And he apparently just told people afterwards he felt so hopeless that he didn't know what else to do. Set himself on fire and sadly died. He was 28 from Somalia, and he also had a wife in the center.
So, what do we know about why is it or and how is it that individuals end up in these prisons in Libya? I mean, most individuals here, it sounds like, are people from Sub-Saharan Africa or the Horn of Africa who are trying to make it to Europe, but somehow wind up in jail cells in Libya. Like, what's the path? Like, how does this happen?
So in February 2017, there was a deal done between Italy and Libya, where basically Italy said that they were going to fund the Libyan Coast Guard to what they called rescue migrants and refugees trying to escape. But it's kind of turned out to also be interceptions to stop them from escaping. And this deal has been heavily criticized because the Coast Guard is kind of known or suspected to have ties with the smugglers who also make their money from shipping people to Libya. And also there's been like a lot of documented incidences of abuse where they either shoot at people in boats or they fail to rescue them or they abandon them. So that's essentially the deal that was done. So since then, tens of thousands of people who have tried to escape to Italy have been intercepted or rescued, as they call it, and brought back to Libya. And pretty much all of them get put in detention centers. So they're then put in indefinite detention in incredibly difficult conditions where, and they don't necessarily have any way out. So one of the ways is that IOM will help them return to their country of origin. But
This is
for a lot of
the International Organization for Migration, the IOM.
yeah, exactly. Will help them return to their country of origin. But for a lot of the people who are there, particularly, people from Darfur, people from Eritrea, some of the Ethiopians, Somalis, they feel that they can't return to their countries and that they're genuine refugees. And so they have nowhere to go.
And so basically, I mean, the IOM says that they will sort of repatriate them. But if you're an Eritrean, you're fleeing this oppressive government that will imprison and torture you if you return. So there's no good option there. Under normal circumstances, though, wouldn't they be able to apply for like refugee status? And what's that process been?
Well, I mean, Libya isn't, a functioning country. I think it's very fair to say it is a war zone. And particularly the fighting that broke out in August and September made that very, very clear that it's not a safe place to be. So refugees can't, like, even if they claim refugee status, they're like, they don't want to be there. So that doesn't work. What is kind of supposed to happen is that there are meant to be resettlement places available. And so UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, registers them and then will help or will try and find resettlement places. But countries essentially just aren't stepping up to provide those places, which means that the people who are there are just trapped. And so there have been a few evacuations to Niger for resettlement from there, or to Romania recently, where they can then do the processing and then find a new space for them. But yeah, that process has just been incredibly slow.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth pointing out like the number of available spots for resettlement around the world for refugees in this kind of situation are extremely limited. Now, even more so since the United States is now at an historic low of the number of refugees they'll accept. And several other countries have also fallen suit and reduced their number of refugees that they're willing to resettle. Do we know like how many people generally are stuck in this kind of no man's land, these prisons in Libya?
I mean, for me specifically, I'm just looking at the people in what are called the official detention centers run by Libya's Department of Combating Illegal Migration, which is what it's called. And so I'm just looking at people who have tried to get to sea and then been returned. So I think at the moment there's about 4,500 in those detention centers. Then, of course, there are people in unofficial ones. And the detention centers, you know, like it's kind of either widely suspected or you know, proven that many of them are being run by people who are also involved with militias or smuggling gangs. You know, refugees say that they're regularly, people are sold out to kind of smugglers who torture them for ransom, or they're sold into forced labor. You know, so it's not as clear cut as them being held by the government. It's all kind of a very fluid situation where you can't be certain who to trust.
And these detention centers themselves, I mean, seem like just incredibly desperately awful places. I remember I had the head of MSF, Doctors Without Borders, on the podcast maybe like last year, and Joanne Liu, and she was, you know, somehow we were talking about like places that she's seen that are particularly awful, and she had recently visited one of these detention centers in Libya. And got like really emotional and just got like said it was like the one place she's ever been to in her life as head of MSF. That was the bleakest, worst, most awful place that she's ever seen, which I think adds some context to what we're talking about and the circumstances that people here find themselves in.
Yeah, I mean, the really kind of strange and surprising thing for me has been like the fact that these people managed to reach out for me. Actually, they're not supposed to have phones, and the way that they're contacting me is on phones that have been very carefully hidden and are being charged or are being loaded up with credit from outside. And I know that some of the people I'm speaking to have said that there have been sweeps of the detention centres where the guards try to confiscate them. And the reason that they're doing that is because they don't want information about the conditions to get out. And and unfortunately, that means that the rest of the world just doesn't know what's happening to these people. And as you said, like the conditions are so horrendous. Like somebody was messaging me last night. They said that there are like several hundred of them just being kept in a dark room. They don't have any windows. They don't get food. Like maybe once a day they'll get pasta if they're lucky, and that'll just be white pasta with nothing else in it. Sometimes they'll be, you know, once every 3 days. I've spoken to people recently who went 8 days without food. They drink toilet water. That's something that I found out is happening in multiple centres, that they just won't be given any water, so they end up drinking water from the toilets. A lot of detainees have TB, tuberculosis, and the reason that that's spreading so much is because they're being kept in very cramped circumstances without, you know, any space, without any fresh air, and they're being forced to share rooms with people who are infected, and so it's spreading among them. The other shocking thing is that nobody knows how many people are dying in these centres. And in one centre, Zintan, I've been told by detainees there that 4 people have died in I think since mid-September, so it was in a month from mid-September. And everybody that I've been asking to try and even confirm these deaths, they just say nobody's keeping track of the number that are dying. In another centre, I was told 7 people have died this year, all from kind of conditions that were either caused or exacerbated by the way that they were being held, and particularly from TB. And then, of course, we have the suicide of this Somali man. So, yeah, I mean, it's really horrendous. And then on top of that, obviously, you have the fact that some of the guards beat them or abused them. I've heard cases of women being raped by guards. And yeah, like those are the people who they're reliant on for food. So they, they just have to put up with all this.
And I might be misremembering this, but did you not maybe when I was with you in New York in September get messages about a woman who gave birth in the center?
Yeah, in one center, Abu Salim, I think there have now been two births. One of the women was taken to a hospital, but one of them just gave birth in the middle of the hall, um, kind of surrounded by a lot of other refugees, like hundreds of them. And yeah, I had a baby girl. So, I mean, they were kind of like, yeah, I was sent pictures of the baby. She was so beautiful. But as a place to give birth, it's obviously not great. And I think the week after that, they went 5 days without food, that whole center. So, to have a newborn baby and a mother and then go 5 days without food, it's pretty horrific as well.
So you mentioned earlier that these abuses and this abusive situation is exacerbated and really caused by this deal between the government of Italy and the Libyan Coast Guard, in which the Libyan Coast Guard is intercepting and then detaining would-be refugees and migrants. Has there been like a broader EU-wide sort of policy response to what Italy is doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this stage, like it is approved by the EU, and the EU is kind of, yeah, both approving it and also then you have this crackdown on rescue ships, like NGO rescue ships. So not only is there the policy of funding the Coast Guard and supporting the Coast Guard, but they also are both kind of trying to stop the rescue ships from operating. And most recently, I think we had the case of the MSF, the Aquarius ship, which was denied a flag after Italy put pressure on Panama to revoke its flag, which means that it can't sail. And yeah, this is obviously, it's all approved by the EU. It's not like this is happening separately to the EU, and the EU, if they knew about it, wouldn't agree with it.
But this was like a decision of like Italy's kind of right wing government.
No, this was done before the
It happened
before the
before.
election.
Okay,
Yeah,
so it's a bipartisan human rights abuse.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
So I guess like what's to be done about this? I mean, what can be done? I mean, is the policy response here just to like pressure Italy to revoke its deal with Libya?
I mean, personally, I'm a journalist. I'm not an activist, and I don't really know the answer to this situation. And I don't, yeah, I can't say what can be done or what people should do. But what I do know is that the information that's coming out at the moment is not showing the full picture of the implications of this. And I've heard European politicians talking about how the new policy is saving lives because they call these rescues. And actually, you know, once people get sent back to, indefinite detention in really horrific conditions that I hadn't really come across happening in other places, you know, that weren't terrible dictatorships, were you know, were like in other situations these people would be given some sort of help, and instead they're being abandoned, and nobody even seems to know the full implications of this policy in terms of deaths or in terms of um yeah, abuses.
I
So
mean,
I don't
yeah.
know what should happen, but I've just been so surprised that this isn't being paid attention to more.
Well, it's just like such a tough situation because I mean, it's an incident in which like the transit country is the one in which where the war zone is happening. That's kind of odd, and it's not. I think a contingency against which sort of refugee conventions were ever, I think, imagined to contend with.
Yeah, and I think it's worth also pointing out that, people kind of say, well, why did they go there? Or, aren't these people stupid to have gone to Libya in the first place? Like a lot of the people that I speak to, they were held by smugglers for about 2 years, a year or two. And so what happens normally is the smugglers, if they catch them, they torture them, they make the families pay massive ransoms of between kind of $2,000 and $10,000, and they only got released. They basically get released to go to sea after the families managed to raise the money. So when they came to Libya, either by choice or because they just couldn't stay where they were, their route was still open. Like, they thought that it was possible that they'd get to Italy. And by the time they emerged from kind of awful torture by smugglers, they then ended up in a situation where they can't go back and they can't go forward.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for your work on this story.
Yeah, you're a very good questioner, very incisive.
Thank you. All right, thank you all for listening. Thank you to Sally for her reporting and for speaking with me. As I said at the outset, I was very glad to be able to shine the spotlight on this issue. And yeah, it's just a really god-awful situation. And you should follow Sally's reporting for more on this and other excellent reporting, frankly, on other refugee issues around the world. All right, we'll see you later. Bye. Oh, and of course, as always, a big thank you to the University of Manchester's Global Development Institute for their ongoing support of the show. We will have another episode from an expert from Manchester's Global Development Institute coming in a future episode very shortly. Bye.